The year is 1945. The war in Europe, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, has finally ground to a halt. Yet, for the city of Berlin, the cessation of hostilities did not bring immediate peace, but rather the chilling silence that follows cataclysm. What remained of Germany's once proud capital was a landscape utterly transformed, an apocalyptic tableau of destruction. Buildings, reduced to skeletal frameworks of steel and concrete, pierced a sky that had, for years, rained down bombs. Streets were choked with mountains of rubble, some reaching several stories high, silent testament to the fury unleashed upon this metropolis. The air, heavy with the stench of dust, decay, and the lingering acrid scent of explosives, seemed to hang perpetually over a populace stunned into a daze. In April of that year, the Soviet Red Army had unleashed its final, devastating assault on the city, a brutal house-to-house battle that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It was in the depths of this inferno that Adolf Hitler, the architect of so much suffering, met his end in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On May 2, Soviet forces declared Berlin captured. 5 days later, Germany officially surrendered. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, lay in ruins, its capital a pulverized symbol of its own monumental failure. But the end of fighting was merely the beginning of a new, complex struggle. The Allied powers, victors in the greatest war in human history, now faced the monumental task of reshaping Europe and, more immediately, governing a defeated Germany. Agreements forged at Yalta in February and Potsdam in July 1945 had already laid the groundwork for this new order. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Crucially, its capital city, Berlin, though situated deep within the Soviet zone, was afforded a special status. It too would be divided into 4 sectors, each administered by one of the victorious powers. This seemingly equitable division, however, masked deep ideological fissures already beginning to crack the surface of Allied unity. For the Western Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and France, the objective was clear: denazification, democratization, and the eventual reconstruction of a stable, peaceful Germany that could integrate into a democratic Europe. They envisioned a future where economic prosperity would prevent the resurgence of extremism. The Soviets, on the other hand, had endured unimaginable losses, their land ravaged, their people decimated. Their primary concerns were security, reparations to rebuild their shattered nation, and the establishment of a buffer zone of friendly states in Eastern Europe, states that adhered to the principles of communism. The arrival of the Western Allies in Berlin in July 1945, 2 months after the city's fall, brought with it a stark contrast. Soviet troops had been the first into the city, their presence defined by the grim realities of war, vengeance, and a different political doctrine. Now, American, British, and French soldiers, arriving with their own uniforms, currencies, and customs, established their sectors amidst the devastation. Suddenly, a city that had been unified under a single, tyrannical ideology was fragmented, not just physically by rubble, but administratively and ideologically by its occupiers. For the ordinary Berliner, survival was the immediate concern. Food was scarce, ration cards were vital, and the black market thrived. Shelter was often found in bombed-out buildings, makeshift shacks, or crammed into the few structures that remained intact. Electricity, gas, and running water were luxuries, often intermittent or non-existent. The city was a wasteland, and its inhabitants, a population traumatized by years of war and the recent brutal siege, faced a winter of unparalleled hardship. Yet, amidst the despair, the seeds of reconstruction were being sown, albeit under vastly different philosophies. As months turned into years, the initial facade of cooperation between the former Allies began to fray. The Soviets, seeking to extract maximum reparations and consolidate their influence, often clashed with the Western powers' efforts to promote economic recovery and political freedom. The currency reform introduced by the Western Allies in 1948, intended to stabilize their zones, was seen by Moscow as a direct challenge, leading to the infamous Berlin blockade. For almost a year, all land and water routes into West Berlin were cut off, a desperate attempt by the Soviets to starve the Western Allies out of the city. The monumental Berlin airlift, a testament to Western resolve, saved the city, but the blockade solidified the divisions. By 1949, the informal occupation zones had hardened into concrete political entities. The British, American, and French zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, a democratic state aligned with the West. In response, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, a communist state under Moscow's sway. Berlin, an island of Western democracy deep within communist East Germany, became the most potent symbol of this Cold War division. West Berlin, a beacon of freedom and capitalist prosperity, stood in stark contrast to the often bleak, authoritarian landscape of East Berlin and East Germany. This divided city, with its porous borders and constant flow of people, information, and ideology between sectors, was not just a geographic anomaly. It was a psychological battleground. It was a place where two diametrically opposed worlds met, where whispers could cross lines, and where the struggle for influence was fought not with tanks, but with intelligence and counterintelligence. The ashes of Berlin, once a symbol of fascist ambition, had become the fertile ground for a new kind of conflict, a silent, insidious war waged in the shadows, laying the perfect, precarious stage for operations of unimaginable audacity. The year 1945 saw the world exhale, a collective gasp of relief as the guns of Europe finally fell silent. But for Berlin, the epicenter of the recent cataclysm, the cessation of hostilities was not a prelude to peace, but merely a chilling interlude before the dawn of a new, far more insidious conflict. The apocalyptic landscape of rubble and shattered lives, bequeathed by 6 years of war, would quickly become the stage for a battle of ideologies, a clandestine struggle that would define the latter half of the 20th century, the Cold War. From the ashes of the Third Reich, a new geopolitical fault line emerged with astonishing speed. The wartime alliance, forged in the crucible of necessity between the democratic West, led by the United States and Great Britain, and the communist East, spearheaded by the Soviet Union, dissolved almost before the ink was dry on the surrender documents. Ideological chasm, once papered over by the common enemy, now yawned wide and threatening. For the Soviets, their victory over Nazi Germany, achieved at an unimaginable cost of lives, justified a defensive buffer of satellite states in Eastern Europe, a cordon sanitaire against perceived Western aggression. For the West, this expansionist thrust was seen as a grave threat to liberty and democracy, a march towards global communist domination. Winston Churchill, in his memorable address at Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946, articulated this grim new reality, declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Nowhere was this iron curtain more starkly, more dangerously manifest, than in Berlin. This beleaguered city, once the pulsating heart of a vast empire, now found itself an island, marooned deep within the Soviet-occupied zone of East Germany. By agreement, the city itself was divided into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. It was an arrangement born of compromise and the shared burden of occupation, but it quickly became an intolerable anomaly in the burgeoning Cold War. Here, communism and capitalism, totalitarianism and democracy, stood face to face across an invisible, yet intensely palpable boundary. Berlin was a microcosm of the global struggle, a pressure cooker where the ideological heat was constantly rising. The city's unique geography made it an intelligence goldmine, a nerve center for the nascent espionage war. Within the western sectors, life began to slowly rebuild, infused with American aid and the promise of democratic freedoms. East Berlin, meanwhile, took on the grim, uniform hue of Soviet influence, its economy centrally planned, its citizens under the watchful eye of a burgeoning security apparatus. The contrast was vivid, a daily visual sermon on the diverging futures offered by East and West. And it was precisely this contrast, this persistent Western presence deep inside what the Soviets considered their sphere, that would ignite the first major flashpoint of the Cold War. By 1948, the tensions had reached breaking point. The Western Allies, convinced that a prosperous and unified West Germany was the best bulwark against Soviet expansion, began implementing economic reforms, including the introduction of a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their zones, and crucially, in West Berlin. For Moscow, this was a provocative act, a direct challenge to their authority and a step towards the creation of a separate West German state. Stalin's response was swift, brutal, and designed to force the Western powers out of Berlin once and for all. On June 24, 1948, all land and water routes, roads, railways, canals, leading into West Berlin from the western zones were abruptly severed. Electricity supplies from East Berlin were cut. The Soviet Union had launched the Berlin blockade, condemning over 2 million West Berliners to isolation, starvation, and a stark choice: capitulate to Soviet rule, or face utter collapse. The world watched with bated breath, holding its breath for the inevitable confrontation. Would the West abandon Berlin? Would they risk open war by attempting to break the blockade by force? The answer came not with tanks, but with wings. The Western Allies, primarily the United States and Great Britain, launched one of the most remarkable logistical feats in human history: the Berlin airlift. For 11 long grueling months, an unending stream of cargo planes, C-47 Skymasters, C-54 Skymasters, and Avro Yorks, roared into West Berlin's 3 airports: Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel. Every minute and a half, day and night, a plane landed, delivering coal, food, medicine, and every conceivable necessity to sustain a city of millions. The courage of the pilots, flying through all weather conditions, often under immense pressure and with the constant threat of Soviet harassment, became legendary. Children on the ground would eagerly await the candy bombers, pilots who would drop small parcels of sweets attached to tiny parachutes as they made their descent. The airlift was an audacious, incredibly dangerous operation, costing the lives of 101 airmen, mostly American and British, in crashes and accidents. Yet, it became a powerful symbol of Western resolve, a defiant middle finger to Soviet intimidation. Stalin, miscalculating the West's tenacity and ingenuity, eventually realized his gamble had failed. The blockade, rather than pushing the Allies out, had solidified their commitment and ironically served to strengthen the bond between West Berlin and the democratic world. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade, defeated not by military force, but by a continuous stream of cargo planes and the unwavering spirit of the West Berliners. The Berlin blockade, though ultimately resolved peacefully, cast a long shadow. It irrevocably cemented the division of Germany, leading to the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, later that same year. And for Berlin itself, the blockade indelibly marked its destiny. The city was no longer just an occupied capital, it was the ultimate flashpoint, a stark, undeniable line drawn in the sand. It became a permanent frontline post in the Cold War, a unique urban battlefield where the stakes were always higher, the shadows always longer. The ease of movement between sectors, particularly before the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, made the city an unparalleled espionage playground. Western intelligence agencies established elaborate networks within West Berlin, recruiting agents from among the stream of refugees fleeing East Germany, monitoring Soviet military movements, and gathering every scrap of information they could. Conversely, the East German Stasi and Soviet KGB infiltrated West Berlin, seeking to sow discord, steal secrets, and identify defectors. The cafes, the parks, the bustling street markets, all became unwitting stages for clandestine meetings, dead drops, and the subtle dance of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Berlin became a city of whispers, of hidden cameras, of coded messages exchanged in plain sight. Every crossing point, every border guard, every seemingly innocuous civilian held the potential for a crucial intelligence coup or a devastating betrayal. This was the volatile high-stakes environment into which Operation Gold, the audacious plan to tunnel under the Iron Curtain itself, would be conceived. The year 1945 saw the world exhale, a collective gasp of relief as the guns of Europe finally fell silent. But for Berlin, the epicenter of the recent cataclysm, the cessation of hostilities was not a prelude to peace, but merely a chilling interlude before the dawn of a new, far more insidious conflict. The apocalyptic landscape of rubble and shattered lives, bequeathed by 6 years of war, would quickly become the stage for a battle of ideologies, a clandestine struggle that would define the latter half of the 20th century, the Cold War. As the city was carved into sectors, a new curtain, not of iron, but of impenetrable secrecy, began to descend across the Soviet-occupied lands, creating an intelligence vacuum that terrified the West. By the early 1950s, this vacuum had become a gaping maw, swallowing vital information and breeding profound anxiety in Washington and London. The initial euphoria of victory had long evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a world divided. The Soviet Union, once a reluctant ally against Nazism, had rapidly consolidated its control over Eastern Europe, transforming nations into satellite states and sealing them off from Western influence. This emergent Soviet bloc, stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans, was more than just a political entity. It was an enigma, a vast, opaque landmass cloaked in deliberate secrecy. Western powers found themselves staring across a newly fortified frontier, desperate to understand the true intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities of their former comrade in arms, now their principal adversary. The stakes could not have been higher. The memory of surprise attacks in 2 world wars haunted strategists. With the advent of nuclear weapons, the consequences of miscalculation or ignorance were catastrophic. The West desperately needed to know if the Soviet Union was genuinely preparing for another war, if its military buildup was defensive or offensive, if its leadership was stable, and what its long-term political and economic ambitions truly were. What was happening behind the Iron Curtain was not merely academic, it was existential. Without reliable intelligence, the West felt it was flying blind, risking a confrontation born of misunderstanding, or worse, failing to prevent an inevitable one. Specifically, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, found themselves facing a nearly insurmountable challenge. They needed granular details: the disposition of Soviet Red Army divisions in East Germany, their equipment, their readiness, and their supply lines. They yearned for insight into the development of new Soviet weaponry, particularly in the nascent nuclear arms race. Beyond military concerns, understanding the internal political dynamics of the Kremlin, the health and resolve of its leaders, and the true extent of Soviet influence over its Eastern European satellites, especially the newly formed German Democratic Republic, was paramount. Was East Germany a loyal, stable client state, or a simmering pot of discontent? What were its own military and security forces capable of? These were not abstract questions, but pressing operational necessities that informed every strategic decision in the West. Traditional methods of intelligence gathering, while still pursued with vigor, were proving woefully inadequate against the meticulously constructed wall of Soviet secrecy. Human intelligence, or HUMINT, the time-honored practice of recruiting and running agents, was fraught with peril. The Soviet security apparatus, the KGB, was notoriously effective, its reach seemingly omnipresent. Agents faced immense difficulty in penetrating the closed society, let alone rising to positions where they could glean truly strategic information. Those who succeeded were at constant risk of detection, capture, torture, and execution. The flow of information was often slow, fragmented, and difficult to verify, a trickle rather than the torrent the West so desperately needed. Double agents and misinformation campaigns further muddied the waters, sowing distrust and confusion. Aerial reconnaissance, another vital tool, had its own limitations. While U.S. and British spy planes pushed the boundaries of technology and courage, flying dangerous missions along and sometimes over the Soviet bloc, they could only provide snapshots of physical infrastructure, troop movements on the surface, and broad industrial capacity. They could map airfields, count tanks, and identify factories, but they could not read the minds of Soviet generals or decode the intentions of the Politburo. Furthermore, the risk of interception and shooting down of these high-altitude planes was ever present, potentially escalating tensions into open conflict. Weather often obscured targets, and technological limitations of the era meant that deep penetration was still largely impossible. Even open-source intelligence, monitoring Soviet media, academic publications, and official statements, offered little beyond carefully curated propaganda. The information presented was designed to project an image of strength, unity, and unwavering resolve, masking internal dissent, economic struggles, and genuine military capabilities. It was a hall of mirrors, reflecting only what the Soviets wished the West to see, not the hidden realities. This aggregate failure of conventional intelligence methods created a profound sense of urgency. The intelligence vacuum wasn't merely a phrase, it was a tangible, debilitating reality that permeated the highest levels of Western governments. Decision-makers in Washington and London felt like navigators sailing through uncharted, storm-tossed waters without a compass. The fear of a sudden Soviet move, a land grab, a technological leap, or even a preemptive strike, was constant. To pierce through this veil of secrecy, to gain direct insight into the heart of Soviet operations, became the paramount objective. It was clear that a new, audacious, and perhaps unprecedented approach was required to breach the impenetrable walls of the Soviet bloc and tap into the very nervous system of their command and control, their communication lines. Only by listening in, by intercepting the raw, unfiltered conversations and directives, could the West truly understand the enemy and navigate the treacherous landscape of the nascent Cold War. The cessation of hostilities in 1945 may have silenced the cannons, but it merely ushered in a new, chilling kind of war, fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers, shadows, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Berlin, the scarred heart of a defeated Reich, quickly transformed into the crucible of this Cold War, a city bisected by ideological fault lines, a microcosm of the global struggle between East and West. For the Western powers, particularly the nascent intelligence agencies like the American CIA and the British MI6, operating in this divided city presented an unprecedented challenge and an urgent imperative. The Soviets, once an uneasy ally, now loomed as the primary antagonist, their intentions shrouded in an impenetrable veil of secrecy. The intelligence gap was not merely a concern, it was a gaping chasm. Conventional methods of espionage, relying on human agents and occasional defectors, yielded sporadic and often unreliable fragments of information. Against the hermetically sealed Soviet system, these traditional tools proved woefully inadequate. Yet, the stakes could not have been higher. The Soviet Union's military might, their technological advancements, and their political machinations in Eastern Europe were all critical unknowns. The West desperately needed to understand their adversaries' capabilities, their troop movements, their strategic plans, and, crucially, their political will. How could one penetrate such a formidable wall of silence? The answer, audacious in its conception and staggering in its ambition, began to coalesce in the shadows of intelligence briefings. The existing Soviet and East German communication networks in East Berlin were robust, extensive, and, most importantly, buried deep underground. They represented a lifeline of information, carrying the vital conversations and directives of the Soviet Military Command, the East German Politburo, and the KGB's operational units. Tapping into these buried arteries of communication would offer an unparalleled window into the heart of the enemy. But how? These were not surface lines, they lay beneath layers of earth, concrete, and Soviet control. It was within the hallowed, often stuffy, corridors of British intelligence that the germ of an idea first took root, likely born from a combination of desperation and ingenious lateral thinking. A bold proposal began to circulate. If the signals couldn't be intercepted from above ground, why not from below? The concept was simple in its core premise, yet terrifyingly complex in its execution. Build a tunnel. Not just any tunnel, but a secret, clandestine passage, stretching from the perceived safety of the American sector directly into the Soviet-controlled East, aiming to intersect and tap into the vital communications cables running beneath their feet. This initial, almost fantastical notion found fertile ground within the burgeoning partnership between MI6 and the CIA. The British, with their long history of clandestine operations and a keen understanding of European geography, brought the initial concept and a healthy dose of pragmatic daring. The Americans, with their vast resources and a growing appetite for high-stakes intelligence gathering, saw the immense strategic potential. Initial discussions were cautious, almost incredulous. The risks were monumental. Detection would mean a catastrophic international incident, a diplomatic nightmare, and potentially a hot war flare-up. The technical challenges alone were staggering. Tunneling beneath a city, through unpredictable soil, under the nose of a hostile superpower, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. Yet, the strategic imperative outweighed the seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Key intelligence officers on both sides, driven by a profound understanding of the Cold War's existential stakes, became the champions of this audacious plan. These were individuals whose names, for decades, would remain obscured by the highest levels of classification. They were not desk-bound bureaucrats, but strategic visionaries, capable of seeing beyond the immediate difficulties to the profound intelligence advantage such an operation could yield. They fought against skepticism, navigating the treacherous waters of interagency politics and securing the necessary clearances and, crucially, the funding for what would undoubtedly be one of the most expensive and risky espionage operations in history. The audacious plan, eventually christened Operation Gold by the Americans and Operation Stopwatch by the British, crystallized around a precise objective. The target was a specific cluster of Soviet and East German telephone and teletype cables, believed to be carrying high-priority military, political, and intelligence traffic. These cables were known to run close to the border, but still deep within Soviet territory, making any conventional tapping operation impossible without immediate detection. The plan called for an entry point in the American sector, a seemingly innocuous building that could serve as a cover for the monumental engineering feat that would unfold beneath it. From there, a tunnel, approximately 450 meters, nearly 1,500 feet, long, would burrow its way eastward. This wasn't just about digging a hole, it was about creating a sophisticated subterranean intelligence outpost. The tunnel would need to be shored up with tons of steel, meticulously sealed against water and ground collapse, and equipped with a complex array of listening devices capable of intercepting and recording vast amounts of electronic communication. It would also need self-destruct mechanisms, a final, desperate measure if the operation were compromised. The sheer scale of the engineering, the logistical nightmare of removing hundreds of tons of earth without detection, the human element of skilled diggers working in cramped, perilous conditions, all were meticulously planned and debated. The Cold War was a conflict of nerve, and Operation Gold was its ultimate test. Success promised an intelligence bonanza, insights into Soviet military capabilities, their intentions regarding West Berlin, their internal political struggles, and the operational methods of their security services. Failure, however, could be catastrophic. A severe diplomatic incident, accusations of Western aggression, and a potential escalation of tensions in an already volatile city. Yet, the belief in the absolute necessity of this intelligence, the conviction that understanding the enemy was paramount to avoiding a hot war, pushed the plan forward. The decision was made. The tunnel, a physical embodiment of the Cold War's clandestine nature, would be built. The cessation of hostilities in 1945 may have silenced the cannons, but it merely ushered in a new, chilling kind of war, fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers, shadows, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Berlin, the scarred heart of a defeated Reich, quickly transformed into the crucible of this Cold War, a city bisected by ideological fault lines, a microcosm of the global struggle between East and West. For the Western powers, particularly the nascent intelligence agencies of America and Britain, the urgent need for eyes and ears behind the Iron Curtain became paramount. The Soviets and their East German proxies were a closed book, their intentions shrouded in a deliberate veil of secrecy. To pierce that veil, the most audacious plan of the early Cold War began to take shape, a project so ambitious, so fraught with peril, that it demanded an assembly of minds unlike any seen before. A secret team forged in the crucible of clandestine operations. The idea was audacious, to tunnel directly beneath the Soviet sector of Berlin, beneath the very ground they patrolled, and tap into their most vital communication lines. This wasn't merely espionage, it was a feat of engineering, a masterstroke of intelligence gathering, and a high-wire act of international cooperation. Such an undertaking required more than just brave agents. It demanded a unique confluence of technical genius, strategic foresight, and an unparalleled capacity for secrecy. The first challenge was not the digging, but the meticulous, painstaking process of identifying and recruiting the masterminds and architects who would transform a whisper of an idea into a tangible, operational reality. From the American side, the Central Intelligence Agency, still in its formative years, saw the immense strategic value in such a project. Key figures within the agency, veterans of wartime intelligence and emerging Cold War strategists, began to quietly assemble a core planning group. These were men who understood the strategic landscape of Berlin, the psychological warfare at play, and the potential windfall of intelligence that could shift the balance of power. They conceptualized the objective, weighing the immense risks against the tantalizing promise of unfiltered Soviet communications. Their British counterparts in MI6, with their long and storied history of covert operations and technical innovation, quickly recognized the brilliance and necessity of the concept. The collaboration was seamless, a testament to the shared urgency and mutual trust forged during the Allied war effort. This would not be a solely American or British endeavor, it would be a joint Anglo-American project, a melding of two distinct intelligence cultures united by a common, formidable enemy. The initial recruitment phase focused on strategic thinkers and operational planners. These were the individuals who would map out the logistical nightmare, identify potential operational sites, and determine the precise targets for interception. But the real challenge lay in the technical execution. The physical act of building a tunnel required a specific, almost arcane, set of skills. They needed engineers, not just any engineers, but experts in mining, civil construction, and geology, capable of navigating the complex, often unstable, subterranean landscape of Berlin. These individuals had to understand water tables, soil composition, the risks of subsidence, and critically, how to dig silently and discreetly beneath a city where every vibration could betray their presence. They needed to innovate construction methods that minimized noise and dust, and devised ventilation systems that wouldn't give away the project's colossal scale. Beyond the pickaxe and shovel, the heart of the operation lay in its electronics. The goal was to tap into deeply buried communication cables, the lifelines of Soviet and East German command and control. This demanded electronic engineers and signals intelligence specialists of the highest caliber. They had to design and build highly sensitive listening devices capable of siphoning off signals without causing any detectable interference. They needed equipment that could process and record vast quantities of teletype traffic and telephone conversations, often in multiple languages, with crystal clarity. The task was akin to performing microsurgery in the dark, without disturbing the patient. Every splice, every connection, had to be flawless, undetectable, and robust enough to withstand the underground environment. The final layer of the team comprised the operational personnel and intelligence analysts. Highly trained field agents, capable of operating under immense pressure, were recruited to manage the day-to-day security and logistics of the tunnel's operation. They would be the ones physically present, overseeing the clandestine activity, ensuring no outside intrusion, and maintaining the absolute integrity of the site. Crucially, once the intelligence began to flow, a dedicated team of linguists, cryptanalysts, and political analysts would be required to sift through the mountains of intercepted data. This wasn't just about collecting information, it was about understanding its context, deciphering its meaning, and translating raw data into actionable intelligence that could inform policy decisions at the highest levels of Western government. But the most challenging aspect of assembling this secret team was not finding the talent, but ensuring absolute, impenetrable secrecy. The project's code name, Operation Gold, would be known only to a select few. Every individual considered for involvement underwent the most exhaustive, intrusive, and unprecedented vetting process imaginable. Background checks delved decades into personal histories, scrutinizing family, friends, and former colleagues for any hint of disloyalty, financial instability, blackmail potential, or ideological vulnerability. Psychological profiles were meticulously compiled, seeking individuals of unwavering discipline, resilience, and an innate capacity for compartmentalization. The stakes were too high for even the slightest lapse in judgment or character. Once recruited, each team member was granted access on an absolute need-to-know basis. An engineer might understand the specifics of subterranean construction but have no knowledge of the intelligence targets. A signals specialist would comprehend the technical nuances of interception but not the strategic implications of the decrypted messages. An analyst would decode Soviet communications without ever knowing the physical location or method of their interception. This rigorous compartmentalization wasn't merely a safeguard against leaks. It was a fundamental principle designed to protect the entire operation. Should one segment be compromised, the larger picture would remain intact, unknown to the enemy. This created a peculiar internal dynamic, a highly specialized group working in extreme proximity, yet with carefully constructed intellectual barriers between them. The burden of this secrecy, the inability to share their monumental work, even with loved ones, placed an immense psychological strain on these individuals. They lived a double life, their minds constantly aware of the colossal secret they carried, understanding that a single misstep, a solitary unguarded word, could unravel the entire, daring enterprise and plunge the Cold War deeper into uncertainty. The cessation of hostilities in 1945 may have silenced the cannons, but it merely ushered in a new, chilling kind of war, fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers, shadows, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Berlin, the scarred heart of a defeated Reich, quickly transformed into the crucible of this Cold War, a city bisected by ideological fault lines, a microcosm of the global struggle between East and West. For the Western powers, particularly the nascent intelligence agencies, understanding the Soviet intentions behind the Iron Curtain was paramount. And so, an audacious plan was conceived, to burrow deep beneath Berlin's fractured landscape, literally digging into the enemy's secrets. This was Operation Gold, and its success hinged entirely on an unprecedented feat of clandestine engineering. To intercept Soviet and East German communications, the plan called for a tunnel, not just any tunnel, but a meticulously engineered, virtually undetectable subterranean artery that would stretch 450 meters, or nearly a third of a mile, from the American sector directly beneath the Soviet communications hub. The challenge was monumental. This wasn't a military trench dug in haste, nor a subway line designed for public knowledge. This was a deep-sea dive into enemy territory, executed entirely in secret, beneath a bustling city still reeling from war, a city where every shovel of dirt, every faint vibration, every misplaced rumor, could spell catastrophic failure. The initial phase involved establishing an operational base that could convincingly mask the monumental construction effort. A seemingly innocuous radar station, designated as a U.S. Air Force supply depot, was chosen in Berlin's Rudow district, strategically located near the Soviet-controlled cables. Ostensibly, the site was for meteorological research and routine equipment maintenance. But beneath this thin veneer of normalcy, an entire ecosystem of espionage and engineering began to take root. High fences, armed guards, and a strict no-entry policy for outsiders solidified the illusion. Yet, within this heavily guarded perimeter, a team of British and American engineers, miners, and intelligence operatives prepared for a battle not against bullets, but against earth, water, and time. The first critical step was sinking the main access shaft, a vertical plunge into the earth that would serve as the gateway to the clandestine underworld. This alone was a delicate operation. The ground beneath Berlin, a patchwork of glacial deposits, riverbed sediments, and wartime rubble, presented an immediate hurdle. It was an unpredictable cocktail of sand, clay, and gravel, saturated with groundwater, a miner's nightmare. Each meter dug had to be shored up immediately to prevent collapse, a process executed with painstaking slowness and absolute silence. The spoil, the excavated dirt, was another major concern. Every bucketful had to be removed, transported, and disposed of without arousing suspicion. It was mixed with legitimate construction waste from the radar station and dispersed in carefully chosen, remote locations, ensuring no telltale mounds of fresh earth would betray their true purpose. With the main shaft established, the true engineering marvel began, the horizontal thrust towards the Soviet sector. The tunnel was constructed using a tunneling shield, a circular steel cylinder pushed forward, slowly, methodically, creating a protective enclosure for the workers. Within this shield, miners worked by hand, often in cramped, claustrophobic conditions, excavating the earth just ahead. As they advanced, precisely manufactured steel plates, each segment weighing hundreds of pounds, were bolted together to form the tunnel's robust lining. These were no ordinary plates. They were specifically designed to interlock perfectly, creating a watertight and incredibly strong subterranean corridor. Over the course of the operation, an astonishing 125 tons of these steel plates were brought in, lowered down the shaft, and painstakingly installed, one segment at a time. But the steel lining alone was not enough to contend with Berlin's relentless groundwater and unstable soil. To ensure the tunnel's integrity and to prevent any seismic disturbance that might alert Soviet sensors, a vast quantity of grout was pumped behind the steel plates. Over 1,000 cubic yards of this cementitious mixture were injected into the voids, expanding to fill every crack and crevice, creating an impenetrable seal and stabilizing the surrounding earth. This process served multiple functions. It waterproofed the tunnel, reinforced its structural strength against the immense pressure of the earth and water above, and crucially, muffled any residual vibrations from the digging. The constant thrum of pumps battling the ceaseless ingress of water became an ever-present, yet contained, soundtrack to this subterranean endeavor. Specialized pumps worked around the clock, drawing out thousands of gallons of water, which then had to be discreetly discharged into Berlin's sewage system or trucked away, again, under the guise of routine waste disposal. Noise was another critical enemy. The very act of digging and construction creates sound, vibrations that travel through the earth. To mitigate this, every tool, every movement, was designed for minimal acoustic footprint. Pneumatic drills were out, hand picks and shovels were often preferred. Communication was often done in whispers or through hand signals. Air compressors and generators, essential for the operation, were housed in insulated compartments on the surface, their hum masked by the ambient noise of the radar station. Ventilation, too, was a constant concern. Fresh air had to be pumped in, and stale, oxygen-depleted air extracted, all while maintaining precise air pressure to prevent the ingress of ground gases and to avoid any outward breathing of the tunnel that might be detected. The human element in this engineering marvel cannot be overstated. The men who labored in the dark, damp, and dangerous confines of Operation Gold were truly unsung heroes. They worked in shifts under immense pressure, enduring the claustrophobia, the isolation, and the constant awareness that a single mistake, a cave-in, a breach of secrecy, a miscalculation in direction, could lead to disaster. Precision was paramount. Using survey equipment, including modified gyroscopes to maintain their bearing, the engineers meticulously plotted their course, ensuring the tunnel veered neither left nor right, neither too shallow nor too deep, aiming for a target 450 meters away with an accuracy measured in mere inches. It was a testament to their skill, perseverance, and sheer courage that the tunnel, against all odds, maintained its clandestine journey, a silent serpent of steel and concrete, inching its way towards the heart of the Soviet communication network. By late May 1955, after months of relentless, subterranean toil, the engineers achieved their objective. The tunnel had reached its target, the thick bundle of Soviet and East German communication cables, buried innocuously beneath a nondescript road. The path to unprecedented intelligence gathering was now open, an engineering marvel completed, poised to unleash a flood of secrets. The cessation of hostilities in 1945 may have silenced the cannons, but it merely ushered in a new, chilling kind of war, fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers, shadows, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Berlin, the scarred heart of a defeated Reich, quickly transformed into the crucible of this Cold War, a city bisected by ideological fault lines, a microcosm of the global struggle between East and West. For the Western powers, particularly the nascent intelligence agencies like the CIA and MI6, the need to pierce the Iron Curtain's veil of secrecy was paramount. The idea of burrowing beneath the very foundations of this ideological divide, to tap into the lifeblood of Soviet communication, was audacious to the point of madness. Yet, it was a madness born of strategic necessity. The objective was clear: intercept Soviet and East German communications flowing through buried cables deep beneath the ground. But the challenge was colossal, almost insurmountable. How do you construct a tunnel 450 meters long, nearly 1,500 feet, from the American sector into the heart of Soviet-controlled territory, just meters from their guard posts and observation points, without alerting the most paranoid intelligence apparatus in the world? How do you move 125 tons of steel, excavate 1,000 cubic yards of earth, enough to fill a small house, and transport it away, all while maintaining absolute radio silence on your true intentions? In a city where every movement was scrutinized, every shadow watched, such an undertaking was a monumental gamble. The answer lay in an elaborate sleight of hand, a deception so audacious it bordered on theatrical brilliance. Hiding in plain sight. The solution was not to conceal the activity entirely, but to create a plausible, overt military operation that would explain away all the telltale signs of a massive construction project. The chosen cover was a new, state-of-the-art radar station, combined with a supply depot, a perfectly logical development in a city bristling with Cold War tension. A site was selected in Alt-Glienicke, a quiet district in the American sector, perilously close to the Soviet zone. Here, amidst what appeared to be routine post-war rebuilding, the real work would begin. The construction of the fake facility was just as meticulous as the tunnel itself. Fences went up, not just any fences, but formidable military-grade barriers with barbed wire and guard towers, a clear declaration of a restricted military installation. These weren't merely for show, they served to deter casual observers and provide a legitimate reason for heightened security. Within this secure perimeter, buildings began to rise. A large warehouse, administrative offices, vehicle bays, and even a mock radar tower, complete with what appeared to be sophisticated antennae. Every detail was crafted to scream, official U.S. Army operation. Trucks rumbled in and out of the compound with manufactured regularity, seemingly carrying construction materials, fuel, and provisions for the new radar station. But beneath the tarpaulins and within the false bottoms, some of these trucks carried a far more critical cargo, the hundreds of tons of earth excavated from the nascent tunnel. The disposal of this earth was a logistical nightmare in itself, requiring ingenuity and nerve. To simply dump it would be to leave a glaring trail. Instead, the soil was carefully mixed with construction debris from legitimate building projects across West Berlin or quietly dispersed at various sites, camouflaged and assimilated into the urban landscape. It was a painstaking clandestine operation, transforming tons of subterranean evidence into innocuous dust and rubble, effectively making it disappear without a trace. The noise generated by the actual tunneling operation was another major concern. Drilling, shoring, moving heavy equipment, these activities produced sounds that could easily carry across the thin divide. The radar station provided the perfect acoustic camouflage. Above ground, a symphony of legitimate construction noise was orchestrated. Generators hummed, heavy machinery moved, and the clatter of tools filled the air. This constant, overt activity masked the subtle, yet persistent, sounds of the subterranean work. Anyone listening from the Soviet side would simply conclude it was the inevitable clamor of a new American military installation going up. Even the personnel assigned to the project had a dual identity. The engineers, miners, and intelligence officers working on Operation Gold were all seamlessly integrated into the fabricated roster of the radar station or supply depot. They wore American military uniforms, carried appropriate identification, and followed a strict routine that mirrored legitimate military duty. Their presence, their shifts, their movements in and out of the compound, all were accounted for under the guise of the overt operation. This psychological aspect of the deception was as critical as the physical one. Every individual involved had to maintain the charade, constantly aware that a single slip, a moment of inattention, could unravel the entire operation and spark a major international incident. The brilliance of this cover story lay in its sheer plausibility. In the tense crucible of Cold War Berlin, the establishment of a new American military installation was entirely expected, a logical response to the perpetual jockeying for position between East and West. It blended into the existing military landscape, a convincing piece of the intricate mosaic of superpower rivalry. It was a perfect storm of misdirection, a daring gamble that leveraged the very paranoia of the enemy against them. The Soviets, ever vigilant, ever suspicious, would certainly have observed the bustling activity at Altglienicke. They would have noted the new fences, the buildings taking shape, the constant flow of trucks. But what they saw was exactly what the Western intelligence agencies wanted them to see: a routine, albeit robust, military development. They were looking at the surface, never suspecting that beneath their very noses, a secret tunnel was being painstakingly carved, poised to tap directly into the nervous system of the East. This elaborate deception was not just a clever trick, it was the foundation upon which the entire colossal undertaking of Operation Gold would be built, a testament to the ingenuity and audacity of Cold War espionage. The cessation of hostilities in 1945 may have silenced the cannons, but it merely ushered in a new, chilling kind of war, fought not with tanks and planes, but with whispers, shadows, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Berlin, the scarred heart of a defeated Reich, quickly transformed into the crucible of this Cold War, a city bisected by ideological fault lines, a microcosm of the global struggle between East and West. For the Western powers, particularly the nascent intelligence agencies like the CIA and MI6, the need to pierce the Iron Curtain's veil of secrecy was paramount. The idea of burrowing beneath the very foundations of this ideological divide, to tap into the lifeblood of Soviet communication, was audacious to the point of madness. Yet, it was a madness born of strategic necessity. The objective was clear: intercept Soviet and East German communications flowing through buried cables deep beneath the ground. But the challenge was colossal, almost insurmountable. How do you construct a tunnel 450 meters long, nearly 1,500 feet, from the American sector into the heart of Soviet-controlled territory, just meters from their guard posts and observation points, without alerting the most paranoid intelligence apparatus in the world? How do you move 125 tons of steel, excavate 1,000 cubic yards of earth, enough to fill a small house, and transport it away, all while maintaining absolute radio silence on your true intentions? In a city where every movement was scrutinized, every shadow watched, such an undertaking was a monumental gamble. The answer lay in an elaborate sleight of hand, a deception so audacious it bordered on theatrical brilliance, hiding in plain sight. The solution was not to conceal the activity entirely, but to create a plausible, overt military operation that would explain away all the telltale signs of a massive construction project. The chosen cover was a new, state-of-the-art radar station, combined with a supply depot, a perfectly logical development in a city bristling with Cold War tension. A site was selected in Alt-Glienicke, a quiet district in the American sector, perilously close to the Soviet zone. Here, amidst what appeared to be routine post-war rebuilding, the real work would begin. The construction of the fake facility was just as meticulous as the tunnel itself. Fences went up, not just any fences, but formidable military-grade barriers with barbed wire and guard towers, a clear declaration of a restricted military installation. These weren't merely for show, they served to deter casual observers and provide a legitimate reason for heightened security. Within this secure perimeter, buildings began to rise. A large warehouse, administrative offices, vehicle bays, and even a mock radar tower, complete with what appeared to be sophisticated antennae. Every detail was crafted to scream, official U.S. Army operation. Trucks rumbled in and out of the compound with manufactured regularity, seemingly carrying construction materials, fuel, and provisions for the new radar station. But beneath the tarpaulins and within the false bottoms, some of these trucks carried a far more critical cargo, the hundreds of tons of earth excavated from the nascent tunnel. The disposal of this earth was a logistical nightmare in itself, requiring ingenuity and nerve. To simply dump it would be to leave a glaring trail. Instead, the soil was carefully mixed with construction debris from legitimate building projects across West Berlin or quietly dispersed at various sites, camouflaged and assimilated into the urban landscape. It was a painstaking clandestine operation, transforming tons of subterranean evidence into innocuous dust and rubble, effectively making it disappear without a trace. The noise generated by the actual tunneling operation was another major concern. Drilling, shoring, moving heavy equipment, these activities produced sounds that could easily carry across the thin divide. The radar station provided the perfect acoustic camouflage. Above ground, a symphony of legitimate construction noise was orchestrated. Generators hummed, heavy machinery moved, and the clatter of tools filled the air. This constant, overt activity masked the subtle, yet persistent, sounds of the subterranean work. Anyone listening from the Soviet side would simply conclude it was the inevitable clamor of a new American military installation going up. Even the personnel assigned to the project had a dual identity. The engineers, miners, and intelligence officers working on Operation Gold were all seamlessly integrated into the fabricated roster of the radar station or supply depot. They wore American military uniforms, carried appropriate identification, and followed a strict routine that mirrored legitimate military duty. Their presence, their shifts, their movements in and out of the compound, all were accounted for under the guise of the overt operation. This psychological aspect of the deception was as critical as the physical one. Every individual involved had to maintain the charade, constantly aware that a single slip, a moment of inattention, could unravel the entire operation and spark a major international incident. The brilliance of this cover story lay in its sheer plausibility. In the tense crucible of Cold War Berlin, the establishment of a new American military installation was entirely expected, a logical response to the perpetual jockeying for position between East and West. It blended into the existing military landscape, a convincing piece of the intricate mosaic of superpower rivalry. It was a perfect storm of misdirection, a daring gamble that leveraged the very paranoia of the enemy against them. The Soviets, ever vigilant, ever suspicious, would certainly have observed the bustling activity at Altglianik. They would have noted the new fences, the buildings taking shape, the constant flow of trucks. But what they saw was exactly what the Western intelligence agencies wanted them to see: a routine, albeit robust, military development. They were looking at the surface, never suspecting that beneath their very noses, a secret tunnel was being painstakingly carved, poised to tap directly into the nervous system of the East. This elaborate deception was not just a clever trick. It was the foundation upon which the entire colossal undertaking of Operation Gold would be built, a testament to the ingenuity and audacity of Cold War espionage.